The ceramic plate clattered against the table as Shanice wiped the sweat from her forehead, her hands trembling not from exhaustion, but from the crushing weight of the eviction notice folded in her apron pocket. And when the well-dressed man in the corner booth, the one who'd ordered only black coffee and sat for 3 hours scribbling in a leather journal, finally stood to leave, she approached with her practiced smile, only to find the receipt signed with a sharp line through the tip section, and a bold $0 written where generosity should have been. But as disappointment flooded her chest and tears threatened to blur her vision, she noticed the edge of something white peeking from beneath his plate. Shanice had been working double shifts at Marilyn's diner for 8 months straight, ever since her daughter, Amara's father, disappeared, and the medical bills from her own mother's cancer treatment had devoured every penny of their savings, leaving them in a 1-bedroom apartment with a landlord who'd grown tired of excuses and late payments. And at 32 years old, she'd learned that life rarely offered second chances to women who looked like her, spoke like her, or struggled like her. So she'd stopped expecting miracles and started surviving on fumes of faith and the innocent hope in her 7-year-old daughter's eyes. The diner itself was a relic of better times, tucked between a laundromat and a closed-down bookstore on the east side of town where the neon lights flickered with the same exhaustion as the people who gathered beneath them, and Shanice had become part of its worn fabric, her name stitched into the rhythm of coffee pots and sizzling grit, her voice a familiar comfort to truckers, night shift nurses, and lonely souls seeking warmth in a world that had grown cold. The man who'd left $0 had arrived exactly at 2:47 p.m. She remembered, because that was when old Mr. Peterson usually came in for his pie. But today the booth had been taken by this stranger to lean, with silver threading through his dark hair and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 untold stories, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Yet he'd ordered the cheapest item on the menu and nursed it for hours while watching her work, writing occasionally, observing quietly. And she'd felt the prick of being studied like a specimen under glass, wondering if he was another person who saw her as entertainment, a story to tell at dinner parties about the struggling waitress he'd encountered in his rare venture to this side of town. When Shanice lifted the plate with shaking hands, her heart already resigned to another disappointment in an endless parade of them, she found a folded piece of cream-colored paper, thick and expensive to the touch, and with a glance toward the door, where the man had already disappeared into the gray afternoon, she unfolded it with the kind of careful hope that comes from being broken too many times to rush toward joy. The handwriting was elegant, each letter formed with intention. Dear Shanice, you don't know me, but I knew your father, Marcus Williams, and 27 years ago, he saved my life in a way I've spent decades trying to repay. Was 17, homeless, and breaking into what I thought was an abandoned building to sleep when your father, working night security, found me, and instead of calling the police or throwing me out into the January cold, he bought me dinner, let me sleep in the break room, and for the next 6 months, he mentored me, helped me get my wrote my college recommendation letter, and treated me like I mattered when the entire world had decided I didn't. He told me that if I ever made something of myself, I should pass it forward but also backward, because the people who raise us deserve to see their investment bloom. I lost touch with Marcus after I went to college, and when I tried to find him years later, I learned he'd passed away, and I never got to thank him. Never got to show him that the 17-year-old boy he saved now runs a foundation that helps thousands. Never got to repay the debt that no amount of money could ever settle. But 3 months ago, I was going through old boxes and found a photograph he'd given me, and on the back, he'd written about his daughter, about his pride in you, about how you had a heart that could heal the world if the world ever stopped long enough to notice. And I made it my mission to find you, not to give you charity, but to offer you what your father gave me, a chance. Shanice's legs buckled, and she sank into the booth, the paper trembling between her fingers as tears carved hot rivers down her cheeks. because her father had died when she was 12, a heart attack that came sudden and merciless, stealing him away before she could understand how much of her strength came from his example. And her mother had worked herself to exhaustion trying to fill the void he'd left, sacrificing her health until cancer came like a bill for decades of stress and struggle. And now Shanice was raising Amara alone, trying to be both the father who'd taught her resilience and the mother who'd shown her sacrifice. But she was drowning, failing, losing the battle against a world designed to keep people like her underwater. The note continued on the other side. I didn't leave a tip on the receipt because what I want to offer you can't be reduced to a transaction. I want to pay off your mother's medical debt, your rent for the next 2 years, and establish a college fund for Amara that will ensure she never has to choose between her dreams and her survival. Beyond that, I want to offer you a position at my foundation, the Marcus Williams Initiative. Yes, I'm naming it after your father, where we help single parents build sustainable futures through education, job training, and community support, because you're not just someone who needs help. You're someone who understands what help means, and that makes you exactly the kind of person who should be deciding how it's given. There's no catch, no cameras, no publicity, just a son paying back a father through his daughter, just the universe trying to balance its books. If you're interested, call the number below, and if you're not, if this feels like too much or too strange, I understand. But please know that your father's kindness created ripples that are still spreading, and you are his greatest wave. Shanice read the note 7 times, each pass revealing new layers of impossibility and grace, and she searched for the signature at the bottom, with eternal gratitude, James Chen, founder, Chen Global Enterprises, and suddenly, the pieces clicked together because even she, living on the margins of society's awareness, had heard of James Chen, the tech billionaire who'd revolutionized telecommunications and then pivoted to philanthropy, the man whose foundation had built schools in forgotten communities and whose face occasionally appeared in business magazines with headlines about conscious capitalism and wealth with purpose. And this titan of industry had sat in her section for 3 hours drinking cold coffee just to observe her, to make sure she was the right person, to verify that Marcus Williams' daughter carried his character in her bones. She pulled out her phone with trembling fingers. The screen cracked from a fall she couldn't afford to repair, and dialed the number, half expecting a prank, a mistake, a cruel joke that would shatter her fragile hope. But a warm voice answered on the second ring. Hello, Shanice. I'm glad you called. I'm Rebecca, Mr. Chen's assistant. And he's been hoping to hear from you. He's actually waiting in the coffee shop across the street. He didn't want to pressure you, but he wanted to be available. If you had questions, would you like me to send him back over? 20 minutes later, James Chen sat across from her in the same booth, but this time without the distance of observation. His eyes soft with an emotion she recognized as the specific gratitude that comes from unpaid debts, finally settled. And he told her stories about her father that she'd never heard, about how Marcus used to bring extra sandwiches, just in case someone was hungry, about how he'd quizzed James on history and math, about how he'd said education is the only ladder they can't kick out from under you, and with each memory, Shanice felt her father's presence fill the diner, felt the warmth of his wisdom wrap around her shoulders, and she understood that she'd never been as alone as she'd believed, that his love had been working in ways she couldn't see, through people she'd never met, across years that had felt empty of his guidance. James explained that everything in the note was real, legally arranged, already funded, waiting only for her acceptance. And he showed her the documents: medical, debt marked paid in full, a lease agreement with her landlord for 24 months prepaid, a college trust for Amara that made Shanice weep into her hands because her daughter, her brilliant, beautiful daughter, who read above grade level and dreamed of becoming a doctor, would now have that chance, that certainty, that foundation. But it was the job offer that transformed something deeper in Shanice's soul. Because it wasn't just financial rescue. It was recognition. James saw her not as a victim to be saved, but as a leader to be empowered, someone whose experience of struggle made her uniquely qualified to help others navigate their own. And he described the position, Director of Family Services, for the Marcus Williams Initiative, where she would design and implement programs for single parents, drawing from her own journey to create support systems that addressed real needs rather than imagined ones. Working with a team of people who believed that poverty wasn't a personal failing, but a systemic trap that required systemic solutions, and earning a salary that would allow her not just to survive, but to build, to dream, to breathe without the constant weight of financial terror crushing her chest. "I need to ask," Shanice said, her voice still shaky, but growing stronger. "Why did you wait? Why didn't you just reach out directly? Why did you come here and watch me?" James smiled with a sadness that spoke of his own past struggles. "Because I needed to know that you were him, that you carried what he gave me, and within 5 minutes of watching you work, I saw I too treated the businessman and the homeless woman with the same dignity. You noticed when the elderly man needed help reading the menu, you slipped extra fries onto the college student's plate when you thought no one was looking. You did all the small kindnesses that no one rewards or recognizes, the ones that only people who've needed kindness understand matter. You are your father's daughter, and this isn't charity, it's investment in what I know you'll become." The conversation stretched into the evening, and Shanice called her neighbor to pick up Amara from school, explaining through tears that something had happened. Something good, something impossible, and when her daughter finally arrived at the diner, backpack bouncing against her small frame, eyes wide with concern about her mother's tears, Shanice knelt down and held her close and whispered, "Baby, I need to tell you about your grandfather, about a man you never met, but who's been watching over us all along." The next 3 months unfolded like a dream. Shanice kept expecting to wake from the medical debt disappeared, lifting a crushing weight from her chest and allowing her mother, weak but surviving, to smile without the shadow of financial guilt. The apartment transformed from a place of anxiety into an actual home now that eviction wasn't a constant threat. And Amara's college fund sat like a promise that her daughter's life would follow a different trajectory than her own, built on opportunity rather than scrambling, on choice rather than desperation. Shanice gave her notice at the diner, and Marilyn, the owner who'd given her a chance when no one else would, hugged her tight and said, "I always knew you were meant for bigger things. You just needed the world to catch up." And her coworkers threw her a party with a cake that read from Waitress to World Champ. And she cried because these people, who had so little themselves, celebrated her rise without envy, with pure joy, and she promised them she'd never forget where she came from. The Marcus Williams Initiative launched on what would have been her father's 65th birthday, and James insisted that Shanice stand beside him at the announcement, that her face and voice be part of the foundation's identity. Not as a charity case, but as a leader, and she spoke to the gathered crowd of donors, community leaders, and press, about her father's legacy of seeing people as they could be, rather than as they appeared, about how the greatest gift we can give isn't money, but belief, and how she planned to build programs that treated struggling families as partners in their own rescue, rather than recipients of pity. Her role at the foundation revealed gifts she didn't know she possessed. She designed a mentorship program pairing single parents with career professionals, created a childcare cooperative that allowed parents to work or attend classes without the impossible expense of daycare, and established an emergency fund that helped families bridge unexpected gaps without resorting to predatory loans. And every program bore the mark of her experience, the wisdom earned from nights she'd cried over bills she couldn't pay, from the specific humiliation of poverty that's invisible to those who've never lived it. James became more than a benefactor. He became a friend, a second father, someone who understood that survival created a particular kind of strength, and he often said that finding Shanice had completed a circle he'd been trying to close for decades, that every success in his life had felt hollow without honoring the man who'd made it possible. And now, through her, he was finally able to say thank you. Shanice's mother, gaining strength as the stress of debt lifted, moved into a small house that Shanice could now afford, with a garden where Amara planted vegetables and flowers, and on Sundays, they'd sit together on the porch. 3 generations of Williams women, and Shanice would tell stories about Marcus, keeping his memory alive in the granddaughter who carried his kindness in her quick smile and generous spirit. Amara flourished with the security that had been absent from her early years. She joined the science club, took piano lessons, dreamed out loud about medical school, without her mother's face tightening with hidden worry, and she understood, in the way children intuitively grasp profound truths, that something miraculous had happened, that an angel, in the form of a billionaire with a perfect memory, had been sent by the grandfather she'd never met. 1 year after the note under the plate, Shanice stood in the ballroom of a downtown hotel at the Foundation's anniversary gala, surrounded by the families they'd helped, the single mothers who'd completed degrees, the fathers who'd found stable employment, the children whose paths had been redirected toward possibility. And she thought about the journey from that moment of despair, pocket heavy with an eviction notice, to this moment of purpose, heart full of belonging. And she understood that her father's investment in a desperate teenager hadn't just saved James Chun's life. It had saved hers, had saved Amara's, had created a cascade of salvation that would ripple forward into futures they couldn't yet imagine. James approached with a photograph, the one he'd found that had started everything. And in it, her father stood young and strong, his security guard uniform crisp, his smile wide, his eyes carrying the same kindness she saw in the mirror when she was at her best. And on the back, in her father's careful handwriting, "My Shanice, born to make broken things whole." And she realized that he'd known, even when she was small, what she would become, and that perhaps this entire journey had been orchestrated by forces beyond understanding, by love that transcends death, by the mathematics of goodness that insist the universe bends toward balance. "He'd be proud," James said simply, and Shanice nodded, unable to speak past the emotion in her throat, because she finally believed it, believed that her struggles hadn't been failures but preparation, that her pain had been shaping her into someone capable of holding others' pain with understanding, and that the $0 tip that had seemed like the final insult in a life of small indignities had actually been the doorway to purpose, the moment when her father's past investment matured into her present transformation. She thought about all the people who'd judged her, who'd seen a struggling waitress and assumed laziness or poor choices rather than bad luck and systemic barriers, who'd never looked deep enough to see her intelligence, her work ethic, her capacity for leadership, and she felt a wave of forgiveness, because their blindness had been part of the journey, the resistance that made the victory meaningful. And she promised herself that in every person the Foundation served, she would look past the surface struggle to see the hidden potential, just as her father had done, just as James had done, just as she prayed the world would learn to do. Amara ran up, her dress twirling, her face glowing with the unself-conscious joy of a child who feels safe enough to play, and she grabbed Shanice's hand and said, "Mama, Mrs. Chen said I can help serve dessert. Can I?" And Shanice kissed her forehead and said yes, watching her daughter weave through the crowd with confidence. And she marveled that just 1 year ago, Amara had been a worried child who hoarded food in her room and asked Mama, "Will we be okay?" with eyes too old for her face. But now she was returning to the lightness of childhood, freed from anxieties no 7-year-old should carry. The evening concluded with Shanice giving a speech she'd written and rewritten a dozen times, trying to capture the impossible alchemy of that moment in the diner. And she stood at the podium, looking out at hundreds of faces, and began, "A year ago, a man left me a $0 tip and changed my life forever, not because of what he didn't give, but because of what he did. He gave me my father back. He gave me a purpose. He gave me proof that kindness never dies. It just waits for the right season to bloom, my father. Marcus Williams saved a boy he didn't have to save, loved a stranger he didn't have to love, and invested in a future he would never see. And that investment has now returned with interest that can't be calculated in dollars, but only in lives touched, families restored, and cycles broken. This foundation exists because one security guard believed that everyone deserves a second chance, because one struggling teenager never forgot that lesson, and because somehow, across time and circumstance, love finds a way to complete its work. The room erupted in applause, but Shanice barely heard it, because, in her mind, she was 12 years old again, sitting beside her father's hospital bed, and he was telling her with his last coherent words, "Baby girl, you've got a light in you. Don't let the world's darkness make you forget to shine." And she hadn't understood then what he meant. Had spent 20 years feeling like that light had been extinguished by struggle and disappointment. But now she understood that light doesn't disappear. It just sometimes needs someone else to remind us it's there. To hold up a mirror and say, look at what you are. Look at what you've always been. That night, after the gala ended and Amara fell asleep in the car on the way home, Shanice sat in her living room with a cup of tea and the photograph James had given her, and she wrote a letter to her father, something she hadn't done since she was a grieving child, and she told him about the man he'd saved, about the life that had been built on his kindness, about the granddaughter who carried his name as her middle name, Mara Marcus Williams, and who would grow up knowing that her lineage was one of radical compassion, of seeing the divine in the discarded, of building bridges instead of walls. And she thanked him for teaching her that wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts, but in the lives you touch, the hope you spark, the love you leave behind, like seeds that bloom long after you're gone. She folded the letter and placed it in her Bible, next to the note that James had left under his plate. The two pieces of paper that represented the closing of a circle, the repayment of a debt that had accrued 27 years of interest and paid out in transformation. And she understood that this was the mathematics of grace, the economy of the soul, where zero could equal everything, where absence could become presence, where an ending could be a beginning disguised. Shanice returned to the diner one last time, not to work, but to visit. And she sat in the booth where James had watched her, where the note had waited under the plate, and she left $100 tip for the new waitress, a young woman with tired eyes and a baby at home, and attached a note that read, "You're doing better than you think, you're stronger than you know, and your story isn't over. Someone is watching who sees your worth. Maybe you should start seeing it too." And she walked out into the afternoon sunshine feeling the warm certainty that her father was smiling, that James was right, that the foundation they'd built would outlive them all, and that somewhere, right now, another struggling person was being seen by someone who'd once been invisible too. And the chain of kindness her father had forged was adding new links, expanding, strengthening, becoming unbreakable.